All righty, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Rule of Law for All information session. If you can't tell by now, we have this set up as a webinar and not sort of your traditional Zoom meeting. I just turned on the chat, so you should be able to use the chat at this point. The Q&A is on. You can ask questions in the Q&A. But we will not have like verbal back and forth with participants today. This is being recorded. It will be up on YouTube hopefully tomorrow. We'll share it with folks so that you can share this with colleagues or rewatch it if you'd like. Definitely would love in the chat if you could share where you're joining us from. We've got some Nevada, Oregon border, Michigan, Vermont, all over the place. So we're really excited to be sharing a new set of resources with you, and I suppose it's a new event, but it's going to happen on an old event day where we are hosting a Rule of Law for All teach-in on Constitution Day, which happens to fall on a Saturday. I don't know who's in charge of deciding when you teach about the Constitution when it falls on a Saturday, but we've decided to celebrate on the 16th on Friday. So we're going to get started, and this is what we'll be talking about today during our webinar. First of all, who is street law? We'll go pretty quickly because typically folks know who we are, but just in case you don't, we'll go over who we are and who the organization Street Law is. Just a little bit more about the context of this project, where these lessons came from, who funded them, sort of the design of the project. After that, we'll talk about the definition of rule of law and sort of the perhaps varied definitions of rule of law and why rule of law education is important. And then Kathy, my colleague Kathy, will jump in to walk us through the instructional materials that we have that were released. I believe they're now all available online today as of this morning. And then finally, we'll end with a little bit more about the teach-in and how you can participate in the teach-in. So that is our plan for this webinar. So this is Street Law. You may notice our new logo and our new look, very sleek. This is our mission, our vision, our core values. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization focused on civic and law-related education, and we are 50 years old this year, I believe. So that's a big deal in the nonprofit world. And this work is brought to you by a much bigger street law team than this team, but this is our teacher professional development team. You're joined today by myself. My name is Jen Wheeler. I am Senior Director of Teacher Professional Development Programs and Curriculum. And Kathy, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kathy Ruffing. I have the same title. And so we're half of the teacher PD team.
Yeah, a growing teacher PD team. If you're familiar with street law, some of these faces are new. So, let's talk a little bit about this project and where this work came from. This work was funded by the Annenberg Public Policy Center. It was a little bit more specifically a part of a funding from the Civic Renewal Network. This project has been underway for about a year and a half, I believe at this point. Here's sort of the big goals of the project that we've undertaken with this funding. The most important part certainly is that we create free and what we believe to be high quality resources you can use in the classroom to help teach about the rule of law in the United States. And through those lessons that students better understand the rule of law, better understand people's lived experiences with the rule of law, that we don't all experience the rule of law in the same way. And then also actions that students could take to address challenges with the rule of law. And part of what we've been doing with this as well is figuring out how this fits into our teacher professional development program. So we did a workshop with pilot teachers as a part of this, and we'll be integrating some of these lessons materials into some of our workshops in the future. The other big goal is about our rule of law for all teach-in and getting folks really involved and excited about teaching about the rule of law, in particular on one day, but hopefully these materials make you excited for more than just a single day. So this is sort of the general outline of how this project worked. We were at this time last year developing these lessons internally and getting them reviewed. And then in January, we introduced these materials to a group of about 40 teachers from Virginia Beach and then from different school districts and schools in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And those teachers got a day of professional development. And then we asked them to try to use at least 4 of the 8 sets of materials in their classroom. Pleased to report that nearly all of them did. And they gave us feedback on all of the materials as well. So we took that feedback and we updated the materials pretty recently in June and July, published the materials, and now we're moving into our teach-in phase of things. So before we get into these materials, we wanted to talk a little bit about, well, what is rule of law? Why does it matter? So there are tons of definitions of the rule of law out there. There's so many that it can be sort of hard to parse through. Sometimes they use different terms or they focus in on different parts of the rule of law. This is sort of the working definition that street law is going with right now. It is certainly subject to change, I would imagine. But our introduction lesson, which Kathy's going to talk about later, actually encourages students to create their own definition of rule of law, and then the class to sort of discuss a common class definition rather than just handing students the definition to rule of law. It's sort of an exploration of how you might define it based on several factors. So we've said that the rule of law has these 6 factors. When society is really strong with the rule of law, these things are true. And it's important to note that first phrase, in societies where rule of law is strong. That's sort of the indication that this is the ideal, that we're working toward them. It's pretty rare that that these are perfect in any country. And so these are sort of the ideal that we are trying to constantly live up to. And if you've been following the news, it certainly seems like the term rule of law has been in the news a little bit more of late within the last few years. One of the reasons for that is that there are several organizations that sort of track the strength of rule of law and the strength of democracy in different countries. And the United States has fallen in the rankings over the last several years. And so that you can see indicated in some of those headlines. You know, where did these materials come from? Certainly they came from the focus on rule of law in the news, in the media, people really valuing the rule of law lately and instruction about the rule of law. We at Street Law have had rule of law materials, pretty dense and deep rule of law materials that we've used in our international programs, but we didn't have anything that was for the US. And we sort of turned the mirror on ourselves. We looked in the mirror and we said, we really need these materials to be, you know, have a US context as well. So that's what this project was about, is adapting those materials. We wanted to make sure that these were a set of materials and not just a one-off resource that teachers could really dig deep into the rule of law if they wanted to. But we also made the materials flexible enough, and Kathy will talk about this in a moment, that you don't have to teach them in any certain order. Obviously, it's probably a good idea to start with the lesson that has the word introduction in the title, but you don't even have to do that. But we wanted to give teachers enough resources that they could really take it to a deeper place than just a single lesson that you know try to fit in where it fits. A lot of states have in their standards significant elements of the rule of law. If we go back to these 6 factors, you see these 6 factors showing up in your state standards, in your courses, in the lessons that you create. Though often in those standards, these concepts aren't lumped together under the title rule of law. And so we wanted to help teachers sort of bring these concepts together under that title. And we really wanted students to better understand the rule of law and help teachers figure out, how do I explicitly teach around about the rule of law. So we have a little, in an effort to be sort of interactive in a webinar setting, we use something called Poll Everywhere to try to get folks involved in things. And this is the link to Street Law's Poll Everywhere. If you want to copy and paste that into a browser, we're curious, now that you've got just sort of a basic definition from us, you might have a lot more with your own knowledge about the rule of law. We're curious about why you think it's important to teach about the rule of law. You're probably here because you value it in some way. So this poll that we have is actually called an upvote poll. And what's going to happen is you're going to be able to type in your response to this question: why is it important to teach about the rule of law? And on my screen, your responses will pop up. And if you see a response that you like, then you can hit a little up arrow and it will take that up to the top so that we can see the most upvoted responses. So we've got some folks starting to participate. If you are less active a participant and just want to upvote things, that's totally fine. But we'll give you a few minutes to get some ideas in why it's important to teach about the rule of law. Now let's take maybe another minute or two. If you haven't upvoted some of these, take a look at what's already there and vote up the ones that you like. If you like them all, you can upvote them all. All right, I'm gonna lock it. Great, well, thank you so much for participating in that. Thank you for reinforcing that we don't need comment moderation on this. It's always a good thing. I mean, we could, these responses are sort of self-explanatory. We've got a lot of great responses here. I think the one that's voted the most, ensure it's equal and just application. That was something that was really on our minds as we were developing these materials, is that this is, rule of law is not something that is equally and justly applied, that we can look at different individuals, we can look at different communities and see that that is not the case. And we wanted to create materials that could allow for the exploration of that as well. Let me jump back over to our presentation. Here we go. So we actually had with this project an evaluator who polled our teacher, who surveyed our teachers, and who actually surveyed students who were involved in this project as well. We've pulled a little bit. We just got a first draft of the evaluation the other day, but we pulled a little bit of that evaluation out and to share with you. So you can see that our pilot teachers, with good reason, I guess, they were involved in teaching about rule of law for several months. They believe that rule of law is really, many of them believe it's really an essential thing that needs to be integrated into instruction. And we'll revisit some of the pilot teachers' experiences with these materials after Kathy goes through what materials are available.
Great. So that's my cue. I'm going to do a flyover really of these 7 lessons and then the culminating activity. Certainly it's not going to be enough for you to decide exactly which lessons you're going to use, but hopefully it'll be a nice preview of the lesson. So you might know by the time we're done with this, what's more likely to fit in with your curriculum. So for these 7 lessons and the culminating activity, one thing that was really important to us when we were writing them was to make sure that students were able to use their own lived experiences and apply to these things, which are, you know, sort of high level concepts, but we wanted to make sure at some point in the lesson, oftentimes the sort of opening activity, students could really see rule of law in their own lives. As Jen mentioned before, we suggest that everyone starts by teaching the rule of law lesson. In fact, it's a little note in every single lesson plan. Maybe you should teach the intro lesson first. It's not, you know, essential. The lessons really stand on their own, but I think it helps to frame it and to put it in a nice context for students. After that, really, there is no particular order. You can use, you know, you can use what fits in your curriculum and not use what doesn't fit. We've heard from some teachers that they would do this as, you know, a unit. Let's stop and do the rule of law unit and do all of these lessons together. And other people are going to use them where they fit in their curriculum. So, you know, so it's whatever fits for you in your classroom with your students. They're also written at a level that will be appropriate for middle school and high school. So there are teacher tips within the lessons that give you some ideas, you know, maybe for a middle school classroom, you might want to do this, or for an advanced classroom, you might want to do that. And then there are some extensions, which I'll talk about at the end, and our suggestions for what you might want to use in each course. Okay, so the intro lesson starts out with the same thing Jen just talked about. We've identified these 6 key factors in the rule of law. And if you Google factors of the rule of law, as you would expect, you're going to get like several different options for that. These are the 6 that we boiled down to and tried to make them explain them in really student-friendly terms. So there is a handout that walks through them and suggested activities for introducing your students to those concepts. And then with those concepts, we suggest that you do a hexagonal thinking activity. And I'm going to drop in the chat. If you've never heard of hexagonal thinking, there's a great blog, The Cult of Pedagogy, and they have a nice article and video that will let you see this in action. But hexagonal thinking is essentially taking concepts, in this case, the 6 factors, and then some ideas around those. factors, and having students think about how they fit together, how they connect in a way that makes them make more sense. So as I mentioned, we used the 6 factors and then several ideas. You can see on there, there's also places for students to write their own ideas, and then for students to explain the connections. And that's exactly what this strategy of hexagonal thinking is good for. It's good for considering connections between ideas and finding the nuances in those connections. It's important that we have a shout out to hexagonal thinking in the chat. It's good to know that there's no right answer or wrong answer to hexagonal thinking, because it's how the groups of students see these concepts as fitting together. So as long as they can explain the connections that they see, it's valid. I did the one on the left with my college age daughter on my dining room table, the paper and cutout version that we have. And then I did the other one on my own with the Jamboard version that we have. And they came out, as you can see, completely different. And that was, days apart with this one of the same participants. We do have a Jamboard option for you on this. So if you are teaching remotely, or if you just prefer to have students use a Jamboard type activity, it's a good option to the paper and cutout version that we have. So that's the introduction activity. We think this is a great way. And as Jen sort of mentioned before, this activity culminates in the students coming up with their own definition of what rule of law is before you may introduce a more formal definition. The next one in no particular order. Well, it actually is in the particular order that it shows up on the sheet that Jen will tell you in a second about how to access it. But other than that, it's in no particular order, is controlling corruption and abuse of power. So for this, we started in the introduction with the story of Governor Blagojevich, which probably most of you know, but your students probably don't. It's a good, actual example, real life example of how sometimes we see corruption and abuse of power. And this lesson has 2 strategies: a gallery walk to introduce the concept of corruption and abuse of power, and probably a lot of you use that. It's a great way to get students to focus on like one particular question, and then post those posters all over the classroom, and then have students walk around the classroom and add their own insights to the answers. It's a good way to get kids up and out of their seat, and and having looking at other students' answers, building on them. It's a good way to foster some classroom community as well. And then it uses our take a stand activity. I think this is one of my and Jen's favorite activities. In this case, you would put posters in your classroom, one that says, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, no corruption, and the another one that says the most corruption. And then there are 5 scenarios that you can go through with your students, and students can decide if those scenarios are showing corruption or not. And then all shades of gray in between, how corrupt is that action. And then as part of the debrief, it's important for them to talk about, how might we try to combat that corruption. Open and transparent government. This is one that starts out with a sort of fake new class rule that students might be sort of upset about. How did that rule come to be? Why didn't we have a say in that rule? And then it goes into a second part where students look at an open city council hearing, right? So how do people bring their ideas out into the open? How are decisions made in the open? And so it is on minimum wage law. And so this is great because some of you have in your curriculum also to talk about that particular policy issue or some kind of economic policy. So this might fit 2 places in your curriculum, both when you're talking about sort of this open and transparent decision making, but also you might be able to weave in this requirement where you need to talk about minimum wages in particular, or economic policy making in general. So in this case, they represent different interest groups that have different viewpoints on the minimum wage law. They're given some background. They're not expected to know, exactly how every group would feel about minimum wage. They're given some information about that, and then they decide how they would weigh in on this, and there's a vote. So many of you probably do this type of simulation, but we know from all sorts of research that simulations of democratic processes are really effective in classrooms, and many of you are required to do them. So someone asked before about the rule of law. How is that? How, I forget exactly. I think it was the question was, I can't find it, but it was about how we measure the rule of law. Well, one of the ways is this World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. And that's what we decided to use for the fair and effective court system, to take a look at the criterion that they use when they grade, for lack of a better term, all countries on if they have a fair and effective court system, and to really take a look at the United States. And so criminal investigation is just one of those aspects. And you can see that they rank the United States, and you can see how that compares to the region and how it compares to global. And within that, they have lots of specifics about it. And this asks the students to take a look at these, and then to give their own evaluation of how they think the United States is doing on these, based on what they know about current events, maybe things that they know about their own community. This is one of the favorite lessons, I think, both from us and from teachers. Probably a lot of you do some variation of this. I know there's lots of variations on this theme, but it gives students a list of fundamental rights, and then students need to pare down those rights. They're told that aliens have invaded, and they're only giving them a limited number of rights, and it asks them to keep cutting the rights until they get down to 3 at the end. So it really makes the students discuss what are those fundamental rights, which are the most fundamental, try to come to some consensus about which they think are more important than others, which is really hard because they're all important. I think that's one of the things that they walk away with, is it's really hard to say this right is unimportant. And so this is one of the favorite ones. And this ends up also with them grading how the US is doing on the fundamental rights that they've just talked about. Jen, do you have anything to add to that? Because I know that's no, okay. Peace and stability. This is a great one that we mentioned before, that one of the things we wanted to do was make sure that the students' lived experiences were reflected in this, and it wasn't always something about, like, the World Justice Project, something really that at a national level or a global level. So this one, this lesson really focuses around what brings peace and stability to a school. And to do that, we had them look at or we suggest that they look at this sort of generic dress code policy, and have groups of students and parents and interested community members weigh in on what they think about this dress code policy, and whether or not it actually promotes peace and stability in the school. One thing that we heard from the pilot teachers, and so we wrote it into the lesson plan, is this would be a great place to use your own dress code policy, perhaps, as opposed to this sort of generic one that we came up with, particularly if your students find it controversial, or or if it's new, or if it's in any way different than this dress code policy. So one of the things we wrote into the lesson plan was, consider using your own, because it might get the students involved at a level bigger than a theoretical dress code policy for some other school. For limiting and balancing government power, of course, one of the things we all think about here is separation of powers and checks and balances. You know, one of the things that when we started to look at this project, we noticed that not everybody has rule of law in their standards. But really what people have in the standards are all of these lessons we're talking about, the things that make up rule of law, even if the words rule of law aren't in their standards. And certainly this lesson, limiting and balancing government power, are in pretty much everybody's state standards. They're in the AP government course and exam description. You know, it's a fundamental, I think, of many courses. So in this lesson, students are asked to look at how a particular pretty complicated bill became a law, and to look to see where different players in this activity, the Senate, the president, the constituents, where they had an impact. And this particular law, it's probably very small. You probably would identify it if you could see it a little bit larger. But this particular law is the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare law. And it's sort of up to you whether or not you divulge that to your students, or when you divulge that to your students. It's really not material exactly to the lesson, except that, you know, it turns out that this is a very controversial law. So you could extend it for sure into the fact that it has also been before the Supreme Court. So I mentioned before, I alluded to the 28 lesson extensions. So all 7 of those lessons have 4 extensions. And we did this because we wanted to make this curriculum something that could be used in all sorts of different classrooms, government classrooms, history classrooms, civics classrooms, global studies classrooms, and so law classrooms. So we didn't want to make it super tailored to any one classroom. So what we decided to do was, for every lesson, there are these extensions that really help them fit into those classrooms too. You can do just the lesson without an extension, or, you know, you could also just do the extension if it's really, if the extension is what interests you. So the extensions aren't quite available yet because there are 28 of them and they're fairly extensive. They will be coming, but if you go to the guide that Jen is going to talk about in a second, you can see what we plan for them to be. So you can see below that this is for the fair and effective court system one. There's like going to be for each one a foundational documents extension. So that would be most likely used in government classrooms and civics classrooms. In this case, not surprisingly, I would think it is going to be analyzing the 6th Amendment, looking carefully at the language there and what it guarantees to people. For US history, looking at cases that revolve around the court system. For current events, we have a deliberation about should violent juvenile offenders be punished as adults. And for maybe a global studies class or something like that, to have an international extension, there is a question about, or there is a take a stand continuum, as I mentioned in one of the other lessons, about adversarial versus inquisitorial justice systems. So this will all be available eventually. And will help you extend them into your specific classroom. I also don't have a slide for this, but when Jen shows you the slide, you're also going to see that we've made suggestions for which of the lessons we feel fit particularly well in different courses. And so the last thing to talk about is the culminating activity. So we called this addressing a rule of law challenge in my community. It starts out really as students identifying what is a potential rule of law, something that we could be doing better on about rule of law in our community, and then thinking of how they might address it. So we underlined some words there because we thought long and hard about what we wanted to ask students to do here. So first of all, we use the word addressing very, very thoughtfully, pick that word very carefully, because we're not going to ask students to solve the problem of corruption in politics like that. You know, these are maybe 7th grade civics students. So we want to make sure that we're not suggesting that they have to solve all of these problems, but how might they address them? A challenge can be something really big, or it could be something very minor. It could be some tweak to a school rule that's going to make something to make things more equitable in their school. And my community would be on purpose made very flexible. So community could be the classroom, it could be the school, it could be the nation. So, you know, you could have your students either give them all the flexibility of those things anywhere from the classroom to the nation, or you could choose a community for them to focus their efforts in. Also, in response to some feedback from the pilot teachers, we made a guide for if teachers really want to take that plan. All we're really asking people to do in our culminating activity is to come up with a plan for addressing it. But we did make a guide that has some suggestions for if you decide to require your students or suggest that your students actually put this plan into action, what steps they might go through to take it to that next step of actually putting this plan into action, whether that's a service learning project or you know, some kind of a campaign.
Thank you, Kathy. So this is just a reminder, if you have any questions about these materials, that you can add them to the Q&A. That's probably the best way if you have questions, because we will easily see them. If you put them in the chat, we might lose track of them. So if you'd like to ask any questions, use that Q&A. I've got a few more slides just about the pilot teachers' experiences with these materials. So here's some of what these pilot teachers agreed on about these materials. I'll give you a moment. A really key part of street law lessons is to make these materials, make our materials interactive and student-centered. And so you can sort of see that showing up in these pilot teachers weighing in, that we want students to be the thinkers in the class, the critical thinkers in the class. We want them to try to grapple with what they're learning about and make sense of what they're learning about. We want them to see if they can do anything with what they're learning about too. And we want them to be able to understand multiple perspectives as they do it. And here's one more slide about some of the strengths of these lessons. We've got some quotes that I can share from teachers as well. One teacher mentioned that the lessons are extremely relevant to students' own lives and compel them to consider other perspectives. Another mention for the engaging part of things, that the variety of activities increase student engagement. These are all, including the extensions. There's a lot of different activities involved here. It's true that we certainly like certain activities, maybe more than others, but we really tried to spread them out. There's some deliberations in the extension. There are some moot courts, actually international moot courts, in our in some of our extensions as well, but we tried to really make varied options for different activities. For the adaptability, someone said, the lessons are malleable. I can adjust them as necessary to fit US history content or to fit government curriculum. And I imagine that they could even be applicable to some other extent in other social studies courses like economics, sociology, or even psychology. And another person mentioned if time doesn't allow for all aspects of the lesson, you can easily modify to fit or chunk into separate class periods. So these lessons are designed to be flexible. We want to allow you to make it work for you. There's certainly no rules about how to do this. Occasionally suggestions, but no rules. And then this is a quote that we got from a teacher that I thought just really stood out. And I can read it. I guess we're recording. That's an accessible thing. The open-endedness of these lessons is also helpful in the tense climate of education today. I constantly live in fear of being reported for teaching something deemed too controversial. This structure allows for lots of flexibility and application on all ends of the spectrum. So I think it's a good way to encourage critical thinking without teaching something deemed arbitrarily inappropriate. So we've got some really positive feedback. Obviously, we're sharing the positive feedback with you. We took the feedback that was about improvements and actually used it to make improvements on these materials, which is why that pilot period was really important to us, to give early access to those teachers and to get them their honest feedback on how things went in their classroom. So I want to pause here to show you how you can access those materials if you haven't yet. I actually need to pull up. So the first thing that you'll want to do is go to our website that has our materials. So that website is store.streetlaw.org. Sorry, store.streetlaw.org. Yes, it says store. No, you don't have to pay for these things. Right now, these materials are on the banner up at the top. They're the very first one, but you can also scroll down and they're one of the first links that you can click on. So when you click on it, it's going to take you to a place where you'll have to add to cart. Yes, it says cart. No, you don't have to pay for it. And once you download it, you will basically just get a single PDF. That single PDF is going to give you a link to these materials. We've created all of these materials in Google Docs. There are a bunch of different reasons for that. One of which is there's so many materials in this that if you downloaded all the materials, that would be a lot of pages. And so Google Docs helps with the organization of these materials a bit more. And then another is that, especially as teachers were doing remote instruction, a lot of them requested Google Docs materials. So this allows you, if you're using Google as your LMS or you're using it with your students, it just makes it a little bit easier for you to adapt these materials. So once you download the materials and then go to the link, it's going to take you to this overview and guide. And if you don't want to read anything in the overview and guide, you can click to go directly to the lessons, but it gives you a little bit of an overview to what these materials are all about. We've got a table of contents for the lesson materials. And then starting on page 3, this is how you access the materials. So if you scroll down, whenever you see a blue link, those are links. You'll click on it. And when you click on it, it'll prompt you to make a copy so that everyone makes their own copies of that, which, then makes these things customizable for you as well. So you'll click on each lesson when you want to access the lessons. And then eventually when the extensions are available, you'll be able to access the extensions directly through this page. You'll also be able to access them through the lessons as well. There'll be links in both those places. So this is how you get to the lessons. If you continue going down farther, there's just some additional resources and guidance. You don't have to use it, but it's optional. If you're a middle school teacher, some guidance on which lessons you might want to use, how you might want to use them. US history, global studies, law classes. And again, this is just guidance. You can do what you want to do. For the AP courses, we identified some more specific course alignment with some of these lessons, so you can figure out, well, what unit in AP Government does this fit into? And then there's some additional resources for building classroom community at the end, because this asks students to talk about their lived experiences, because it gets into what are sometimes challenging topics to discuss. We wanted to give some additional resources to help you with that. So the very last part of this, I'll go through this kind of quickly and we'll have some extra time for questions at the end, is about our rule of law. Yes, you did see comparative government in there. I just didn't show it, didn't scroll down far enough to show it to you, but we've added that as well. So the rule of law for all teaching, what is it? How can you participate? Well, probably good to start with just a working definition of what a teach-in is. Again, this is our, just like rule of law, this is our definition of a teach-in. It's okay if you have a different version of what this means, but it's essentially about taking this complicated topic, helping students understand it in a participatory way, in a way that is practical to their own lives. And so that's what all of these lessons are about. So ideally, sort of the big goal for this teach-in is just that teachers teach about the rule of law that day. Exactly how you teach it is up to you. We've got resources for you to do that. But if you've got your own idea for how you want to teach about the rule of law, then that's great. You can do that too. We've got some different ways, suggestions for how you might participate. So I think the perhaps the easiest one, or one of the easiest ones, is just teach a lesson. Teach one of these lessons. Let us know how it goes. If you're on social media, post about it. If you're not, just do it. And it's like the tree falls in the forest. It still fell. You still did it. And so that's great. We're still learning about the rule of law. And then we've also got some sort of centralized activities that we're doing that day. So we'll have a social media chat that's going to happen, where we'll post on Facebook, we'll post on Twitter, we'll post on Instagram some questions throughout the day, and you can respond to them. You could share them. You could have your students, if that's something you're comfortable doing, engage in that. We've got a really straightforward, super simple rule of law student reflection. That's just a quick form students can fill out anonymously to share some of their thinking about rule of law. You can opt in to getting their responses emailed to you if you'd like. But that gives us an opportunity to share some of students' thinking anonymously throughout the day about rule of law. And then we also have a rule of law panel that we'll be doing with some experts on the rule of law. This is a student-focused panel, so we're going to be running it during the school day. We will be recording it and trying to very quickly turn it around to be a recorded option, that if you don't make it during the time that we run it live, you can hopefully share it or some clip of it with your students. Kathy, do you want to add anything more about that?
Yeah, we're just still firming up the experts, but we do know that it will be from 1 to 2 Eastern time. And as Jen said, we'll try to turn it around and have it available as soon as possible, in case you want to use it in other classes, or I know on the West Coast it's always hard. So we tried, we tried 1 to 2 because we figured we hit everybody in school, but but it's hard to pick a time that's good for everyone across the country. So we'll do our best to get it turned around as soon as possible.
Yeah, if it works, it works for you. If it doesn't, then you can show some clip of the video at a later date. That video will live on Street Law's YouTube page. And as soon as we know more about the experts, we will certainly put them up there. You can sign up for it now. It's suggested that you sign up for this and not your individual students, that you sort of sign up yourself as the class.
Yeah, I should have also added that there will be an opportunity to submit questions in advance, and then there'll be 2 ways that you can put in questions during the actual webinar. One will be for teachers to put them in the Q&A, and the other will be for students to text them to Street Law, and then there'll be Street Law staff and moderators who voice those questions to the experts. So students will not be on camera in case this is a concern of yours. Students will not be on camera. Their voices won't be heard. Their questions will be relayed to the experts through staff and moderator.
Thanks, Kathy. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A that Kathy's answered, but we can sort of highlight. She's answered them. She's written answers to them, which you should be able to see, but we can also highlight some of these. So Kim asked about summative assessments for the lesson. We have those debriefs, definitely could be used as writing prompts. We also sort of designed the cumulative activity addressing a rule of law challenge as a way to bring students learning about all of these lessons together into one activity. And that's sort of how a lot of the pilot teachers, that was we asked pilot teachers to use 2 lessons that we chose for them, and that was one of them. And then they got to choose 2 of their own. So everyone used that as sort of the end activity for their pilot. Kathy, do you want to take one of these? Or you want me to take all of them? I can do whatever you want.
Well, I think you already answered what is the 16th going to look like?
Mm-hmm.
So the other question about how, it's sort of the classic teaching question, right? Like, how do I do this and not make it another thing to do? So the question was, I'm curious as to how teachers have integrated these lessons into their existing scope and sequence. My concern is that this adds on to rather than replaces what folks might else be using. It's a little hard for us to know that because in the pilot we did, as Jen just mentioned, we did mandate 2 of the lessons that they did. So that certainly was an add-on for them. But then they had 2 to choose. And I think what we heard from teachers more than anything was that they used them to replace things that they might have done in like maybe a more traditional way. So that they would have done with lecture, or they would have done with a worksheet, or they would have done with something, maybe that wasn't quite as engaging. And so it's a little hard to say just from what we saw in the pilot, because they also had like a time constraint that you wouldn't have if you were looking at a school a full year. But if people have ideas they want to drop in the chat for that, that would be great too. I think the answer is that, I mean, if this were my classroom, I think the answer would be that there are a lot of things. I taught AP Government and Law for 27 years. I think my answer would be that there were a lot of things that I was already teaching that these lessons would act as a substitute for. And because you don't have to teach it as, you don't have to teach all 7 lessons in the culminating activity. I mean, I would say that if something really is an add-on, then that would be something you might just choose not to use. If it doesn't fit in your curriculum sort of organically, then there would be no reason to have to do that because the lessons don't build on each other. So
yeah. We've also offered some suggestions to help you better align to things that we know are typically in standard. So I pulled up the just some guidance for US history as an example. US history typically has some standard that involves corruption, whether it's during the Jackson administration or it's during the Nixon administration. And so teaching about the concept of corruption as a factor of the rule of law, and then bringing it to some specific topic that might be in your standards, like Watergate, for example. So we've tried to do a little bit of that type of work in, I can pull up there's the AP Government as well. We've tried to do some of that alignment here as well to help you start thinking through how does this fit in. Any other questions before we sign off? We definitely appreciate y'all being here and being so engaged. Just as a reminder, this recording will be available on Street Law's YouTube. We'll probably also share it via our social media, newsletter, that type of thing. And worst case, you can email us. So to wrap things up, just some final things. If you're not following Street Law with social media, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're also on LinkedIn and Instagram. So you can find us just about everywhere. We will be using social media to promote the rule of law teach-in, and we'll be using it pretty actively the day of the teach-in. If you are not signed up for our newsletter, definitely sign up for it. That's your best way to know what's going on with street law. I think that should say sign up. And then finally, if you have any questions for either Kathy or myself, you can email one of us, you can email both of us. Those are our email addresses. We're happy to share with you more information about this. But we appreciate your time, and good luck this school year.
Thank
See
you all.
Thank you.